All right, that was really, really rich. And I hope you all feel the same. That's a lot to digest. And it's all very good stuff, too. So my question starts with an observation. And it seems that you are all in the business of epiphany making. Like you are producing epiphany. And so my question is, what does it mean for you personally, professionally, or as a citizen in the world to be modified by these epiphanies that you are producing? Like, what does that end up looking like? What kind of humans are you becoming as a consequence of these epiphanies impinging on your lives? Like, who are we, or who are you becoming as a consequence of these new things that you're learning, that you're making visible? Anyone can start.
I think it's a great question. I don't think of my own work that way, but I think it's a productive question to think about epiphany as an opening, particularly when we have so many interesting people together here on this panel from different fields and perspectives, and yet kind of converging around questions of invisibility and materiality and politics in one way or another. I don't know. I mean, maybe I can.
I want to push you on that though, because you're very much like one of the people in media studies that was like, no, let's think about infrastructure, and that's a different way of seeing than what media studies was before, when like people were looking at images and narratives and stuff like that. And like obviously you started looking at the world differently. Because I have hung out with you, and you're like, oh, this is the place where like this cable goes from here to here, and that tower does this and that. You're literally seeing the world differently.
Yeah, it is true that, I mean, my whole interest in infrastructure was because I was socialized as a young woman to not be interested in how things work and how they're set up. In some ways, being a media scholar, I've become more and more interested in electrical engineering. And I remember seeing, I wrote, one of my first papers I ever wrote was about TV repair, and realizing that if something broke down, one of my electronics broke down, I didn't have the knowledge or even the inclination to like crack something open to try to figure out how to address it or fix it. And so I feel like any epiphany work that has happened for me has been about like dealing with issues and questions of technological literacy, and how that is a political issue. Knowing how things work, where they're located, who owns them, how they're structured is important, and it's not something that's readily apparent all the time, especially when we're getting into the kind of things that you're looking at, Trevor, too, or the chemical issues, or even the electromagnetic spectrum, how to find languages for making intelligible phenomena that have incredible bearing and power over us as societies. Tried to get this conversation going.
I can try to say something.
Sure.
So I kind of ended on the point of thinking about land-body relations, and my kind of work right now is about thinking about decolonial approaches to chemical exposure. And that, along with EDGI, has required all sorts of changes. So one is learning how to do horizontal collaboration using consensus in research with others. So really kind of getting out of individual research modes has been something that is changing. I would say, like, the question changes me. Another part of the project is trying to figure out how do you bring questions of decoloniality actually into labs. So that's a kind of question that involves working collectively and bringing different kinds of people together in lab places and kind of questioning like who's in the lab and what's there. What does it mean to bring Black and Indigenous futurists together to think this question, which is another part of the project. So that brings in a lot of art questions and a lot of questions of the imagination and aesthetic production. And then I think another side is that because as a kind of a white-skinned person, I've been able to exist in the academy without talking a lot about myself. But this project has like really required me to be more exposed as a person in academia, which is sometimes a good space, but not always a safe space. And so that's another thing that it's required of me, is to be more vulnerable and open.
Go ahead, George.
Yeah, about epiphany, I guess for a geek like me, epiphany is a strange word because we tend to be satisfied by very esoteric things, such as an equation that happens to work out in the laboratory or whatever. But I must say, sort of the projects I described, maybe it would have been obvious to a social or a humanist like you, but to us...
But you have eureka moments. Scientists have eureka moments all the time.
Yes, that's true. But the fact that these eureka moments can actually create such strong emotions to people, I saw people actually actively writing hate blogs about us, right? Because, well, we're enabling the government to do these awful things. To me, that was a eureka moment in its own right, and kind of unanticipated. So I thought I might bring it up. Yeah.
Trevor, I had a question for you about the apple, right? So isn't there a way that we can see the language of ceci n'est pas une pomme, right? As a resistance to what the machine is clearly seeing, right? Because the machine does not know the inside joke about the art world, about Rene Magritte, right?
Yeah.
So isn't there some kind of, push that's going on in that?
That's exactly what I was trying to show in that particular slide. Whereas, you can read that Magritte image as a kind of a funny thing about where he's making a commentary about representation or something like that. But you can have a more political read of that, where he's showing you what is a condition of possibility of a certain kind of freedom, and that freedom is to define something or define it in a different way.
Right.
And then by putting the AI thing on top of that, I was saying the kind of freedom that Magritte is trying to enact in this image is foreclosed in these kinds of systems. Right.
Great.
So that was the kind of logic of showing that image.
Great. Right. All right, so we have some questions. The first one is for Trevor, and it reads, Murphy suggested a politics of consent for the way data is used and manipulated. Is that a possible way forward for operational images? And if so, how?
Sure. I mean, everything's possible theoretically. I mean, but we get to. I don't know, and I'm not a policy person. I mean, I feel bad sometimes because I make these provocations and then say well, I'm an artist, it's not really my problem. You know what I mean? And that's just kind of my instinct to do that. But I don't know the answers to these things. I don't know what's reasonable to expect, and I have very just fundamental questions about this stuff at all. I have friends of mine who are very great and well-intentioned people who work on data justice, someone like Kate Crawford or Julia Angwood, just doing fantastically important work looking at bias in machine learning and that sort of thing. And they're I worry about the whole project in the first place. What is this project of quantification? What is this? And they would say, yeah, well, that's going to happen anyway. Quantified life, that's always been a thing. And I'm well, you're bringing it into more and more intimate parts of people's everyday lives, right? And you're colonizing more and more kinds of spaces that were previously outside of the market and were previously not visible to state power. And I think that is very dramatic, although that's been the tendency that's been in play for a very long time. So I don't know. But I know that we need to think about it.
Fair enough. Another question, I think it's just for the panel. How do we balance training systems to see the full spectrum of gender and race without building systems that lend themselves toward profiling or categorization?
That's the same thing. That's the point, right? Is profiling. Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, you can create systems that can see difference, and actually difference can be a feature of the system, because what you're trying to do is discriminate, right? Like that's the point. That's the feature of the systems, right? So yeah, I don't. It's the same thing, in my opinion.
Lisa, I was hoping you could say more about this notion that the image is a logistical field of operation now, right? Because it seems to me what that means is that that might be the dialectical opposite of the slow movement of reading and analysis and interpretation. So I'm very afraid now.
I mean, there is a history of liveness in electronic media that precedes the digital era, and it really goes back to radio, right, and even telephony for that matter. But I think what people who are working in the field of logistical media are interested in is the way in which networked images that are live are able to be, acted upon instantaneously in ways where there are not decisions about ethics or repercussions, but the systems inherit pre-existing logics, like a kind of, a system of governmentality gets orchestrated through live media, where a pattern of operations will kind of sediment and be decided upon as legitimate and viable, and then be mobilized through a live media interface. And we see this with drone warfare. There's a parody online called The Ethical Governor, where basically the drone is completely autonomous and has inherited an architecture of decision-making that ensures that its targets are rationally and morally chosen, and that the decision to drop a bomb also is something that has already been morally vetted. And this is a kind of, apocalyptic prognosis about the way that drone warfare might manifest, but it gives us a space, a kind of artistic, parodic media space to begin thinking through the politics of drone warfare, especially when we look at the news headlines now. And I don't know if you've noticed, there was a lot of discussion of drone in the headlines from about 2009 to 2015, and now they're called airstrikes. The actual word drone has disappeared from headlines. I've been tracking this. And they're called airstrikes rather than drone strikes because there were so much negative kind of coverage about how they were being used for targeted killing programs and what the capacities are. I mean, that's just one way of spinning that question and conversation, is to think about that set of issues.
Here's another question from the audience. Bratton called the shaping of AI as humans' bigotry. Can we in any way build machine intelligence that, through more autonomous behavior, can oppose power?
I hope so.
Maybe resistance is not futile after all.
That's an interesting question. I mean, Turing, if you go back, 70 years ago or so, he defined AI as a kind of an interface where you are talking to someone and you don't know if it's a person or a machine, but if the machine can convince you that it is a person, then you call the machine intelligent, right? Roughly, this is Turing's definition. But this question, I do not know how to answer, but it kind of provokes the comparison. If the humans are sometimes expected to be racist, for example, should the machine also be racist? I mean, is that the nature of the question, or how do you stop the machine from being racist?
I wish I could read this person's mind. I don't know.
But it does provoke this comparison, right?
I have a thought, which is, one of the questions that have been recurring in this conference has been how to scale things up. right? So how do we scale like technologies up, or it's like intelligence up, or how do we think about like infrastructurally, and the kind of implicit desire is that what we want to do is scale things up, right? And so when we ask these kind of questions about like what do we do, how do we do politics, there's this kind of also implicit thing that it should work at this like scaled up level. And that, if we talk about like practices of consent, which are also practices of refusal, that it should be at the scaled up level. It should be about building a scaled up system. And so I think, there's something we can do about reflecting about our theory of change here. That we have to kind of wait until we can have the scaled up solution before we're like satisfied with our politics. I think that there's much more intimate scales of non-deferral for taking up these questions where we don't have to hold ourselves to the logic that it must be scaled up in order to be doing something in the world. So that's just a kind of a thought about like the way we kind of form the question about what we want out of like technology and our relations to it.
Actually, this is something that I meant to ask Trevor about. The very last thing you mentioned, that we train all the systems, our neural networks from the past, and I think this is what you're saying too. It was very, very briefly at the end of your presentation, and it struck me something very important that I had never thought before. Can you elaborate on that? I mean, how can we make machines perhaps be more predictive of, or actually more accepting of change, when by necessity we can only train them from the past?
I think that the thing that I worry about is that that's not an engineering problem. You know what I mean? And if
Okay,
that's not an engineering...
I don't have to worry about it.
No. No, I mean, I think that's a political question, right? I mean, ultimately, all of these are political questions, including all the engineering ones. But I don't know. I mean, I think that I've heard ideas around looking at the optimizations that some of these things are able to perform. They're so dramatic that I've heard people say like there should be something like, nuclear inspectors for AI and decide whether as a society we want to perform this operation or this optimization, right? Do we want to have self-driving trucks that is going to completely collapse the economy of the South, right? And just take millions and millions of what are now, okay paid jobs out of the economy. And I think the proposal is like that we're getting to the point as a society where you're making those decisions one way or another. We just have to, maybe we should be more conscious about that, and that we shouldn't just leave it up to Uber to decide that for the entire society.
All right, another question. A CV system, I don't know what CV stands for.
Computer vision. Got it.
A CV system that can't see a black girl is like Morrison's shopkeeper. Very good audience. Do we have a responsibility to train CV to see diversity despite the risk of discrimination?
I mean, the question is, how are you going to use that?
Right.
So, I mean, we want to see diversity, and we want to do that as a way of trying to create more equality, right? Julia Angwin, again at ProPublica, just published an article a few weeks ago that was just looking at zip codes and auto insurance. And guess what? If you're in a zip code with black people, you're paying 30% more for auto insurance, even if the insurance company itself is paying out less money per user. Right? So, so that's seeing diversity in order to create a predatory structure. Right? So, I think that, for me, that's just the answer. Like, what are you trying to do, not what you're trying to see?
Right, exactly. What value you're placing on what you're seeing. Okay, does anybody here have something that they are hankering to say or share? Yes.
I guess what's going through my mind is, I started thinking in our kind of what's now being called post-truth era,
Hi. And then I'm thinking how odd it is to be someone of my generation that it was we were always critiquing truth.
Yeah.
Right? And we were always trying to dismantle truths and pluralize them, et cetera. But then I thought, like, well, truth has always been something that is struggled for. It is never not struggled for. Never has been not struggled for, you know? I mean, to have black people seen as humans, that was a long, centuries-long struggle and still going on, you know? And I guess I'm wondering how different, I mean, I know this is what you're trying to tell us, is how different it is now, you know, that like how the terms of the struggle are changed. And we need to wake up to that we're at a kind of disadvantage we've never been able to even conceive of. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yes.
Okay, one more question. Thank you. No, one more question.
What was the answer?
Yes.
But speaking of vision, what about the fact of, say, you know, I mean, the killing of black men by the police did not start in Ferguson.
Of course, yeah.
But everybody has videos now, and the same machine that takes the image distributes the image. And is there not some kind of hope in, sorry, I asked about hope, sorry. Is there not some kind of thought that, you know, as we also become more technologically enfranchised, that there are ways to counter? Or does it just seem like that's preposterous? We will never...
There's ways to counter, of course, but I guess I'm worried about, like, is there an underlying epistemological problem, which is that, like, sure, you can develop quantitative systems that can be like, oh, well, this cop just, like, broke this law and therefore should get fired, right? And this person just jaywalked and they should get a ticket. But what I'm wondering if that's actually how we want to think about solving these problems, because I would argue that, sure, you can, like, make police brutality more visible and thereby maybe make it go away. But I don't know if you want to think about kind of quantified solutions to these sorts of problems, because I would probably argue that at the end of the day, you don't want to do that. You need to find ways that keep that ability to contest the meaning of things and the meaning of actions alive, you know? I don't know. I'm just saying, like, I'm just scared about this stuff.
Anyway.
But I like what Michelle says about counter infrastructures and maybe thinking about infrastructures of struggle. And maybe to answer Sandy's earlier question about epiphanies, I think one of the things that I, in retrospect, realized might have been an epiphany that helped me in some way get toward convening this panel was something that Donna Haraway wrote in the 1990s, in which she exhorted her readers to ask the question, with whose blood were my eyes crafted? And so a number of words jump out, blood, which might sort of be about struggle, about histories of community, about infrastructures of struggle. With whose blood were my eyes crafted? The question of who's speaking, who's seeing, from where, who is the we, and then eyes, which are these technologically described infrastructures of phenomena, of phenomenology and apprehension, as your invocation of Jonathan Crary pointed us to earlier on, Sandy. So, I guess that was an epiphany that may be behind some of my thinking about this. What is struggle? Who is the we? And what are the technologies of visibility and invisibility? And those are historically transforming. So, you know, to speak to Claire's query, which is a query about change and continuity, there are different kinds of infrastructures, and although there are continuities, being very keenly tuned to the technological transformations and affordances, even if they're sort of just tactical rather than strategic, might be one way to think.
Maybe I could add something to that, which is, you know, working on chemical exposures for some 25 years, when I started, you know, talking about the way that chemical exposures are rendered imperceptible, that was something that took a lot of work to show people. And now, you know, when we, you know, have that kind of argument next to like the kinds of things that Trevor and Lisa are talking about, the way we manifest our ability to visibilize violence seems absurd. Our system for understanding chemical violence or for understanding and visibilizing externalities and economic processes, our system of like invisibilizing racial violence and white supremacy, all those systems are now seeming more and more absurd and legible to people. And so there's something, even though those processes have been happening for maybe hundreds of years, there is something that I find a potential there in that they do seem more absurd and untenable to uphold at this moment to more people. And so I take some kind of energy from that thought.
There's a flip side to that. If you could actually visualize them, like if we could see the dangerous particles around us or in the water, boy, we would pay much more attention to them, right?
Exactly. Exactly. I mean, we would live in a really different world if we were visibilizing industrially produced exposures that are happening constantly.
Other than the obvious fire, I guess. But
No, exactly.
the point
The
is they happen
fires-
all the time.
They're happening constantly.
That it's a recipe basically for taking things for granted. Yeah. Natasha has a question.
I guess I want to ask, thinking to the images of the number of bodies on the mall on Inauguration Day, and then I was struck also during Michelle's talk by the Canada's list of chemicals, and I almost wanted more. Like I wanted the pages to go on more and more. And I see Trevor nodding, but I'm pushing back on him on something he said with where I'm going with this, which is. A lot of that was about quantification and about counting. Yeah. And so I'm wondering, do we want to, you've said a few times that you don't know that quantification is the way forward. So I want to ask you, but also Michelle and anyone else who wants to jump in, whether, is quantification the thing that we want to turn into a problem here, or is it more the automation of interpretation?
I think that's right, the automation of interpretation.
Oh, that was an easy answer.
Yeah, easy. Like, obviously, right?
There's a question.
Oh, no one's answering it?
Yeah, there's a hand.
There's a hand.
I have a question for Trevor as well. I was wondering, you as an artist, if you ever struggle, if there is a struggle that you're just exposing these images and working with these images, and the fact that you could also make the choice of being an activist and do something about it, and how you're dealing with this struggle.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't struggle with it because I work with lots and lots of activists, and this work is very much alongside that kind of work. So it's that's always been a part of these projects. Having said that, I do want to live in a world where art is can be something other than like instrumentalized in the service, like of a political project or something like that. And I'm not sure that that's actually possible, but I would like to live in a world like that. And I would like to live in a world in which you can make images that are self-contradictory or that are complicated or that that put you in a viewer in a situation where you have to ask yourself what you think you're seeing or what your relationship to that kind of thing is. So yeah, I mean, all of the projects that I've ever done pretty much in my life have been done to one extent or another in collaboration with different kind of people doing activism, whether that's Human Rights Watch or Reprieve or the Center for Constitutional Rights. I mean, there's a long, long list of people that I've collaborated with over the years on this stuff. But that doesn't, but I also think that we can have like divisions of labor and that we can have a society that has artists in it and that those artists can do things that are different than what activists do and that's different than what policy people are doing or what have you.
In your writing too, you talk a little bit about work by like Adam Harvey, artists who are developing ways of jamming biometric facial recognition systems by either designing masks that confound those machine vision systems But there are low-tech versions of this too that are, just the hoodie. A lot of people, wear the hoodie or the anonymous mask to try to not be recognized when they're at mass demonstrations and protests where they know that there might be police cams mobilized. Another technology being used at these now are the MC catchers as well, the cell site simulators, which are also being blended with camera capture systems. There's a system called Suricatch where you can post it on an electrical light pole. It just looks like an ordinary electric box, but it actually has a camera embedded inside and an MC catcher that catches the international mobile phone subscriber identification number of each person that passes in its vicinity. So it has all the numbers of everybody's phones while it also captures wide-shot video footage. And these systems were mobilized a lot after the Boston bombing because the police had to crowdsource cell phone video in order to run that material through systems and try to identify suspects. So now there are these blending of cell phone interception apparatus with machine vision capture
at the
systems.
airport in Dubai, when you go into customs, if you have your phone on, there's an MC catcher that associates your phone with a picture that it takes of your face when you go through customs. So then you can go and they gotcha.
So yeah, I started that by saying thinking of how one can put something on the face to resist identification. And I do think there's a lot of artists, Trevor and other artists, really exploring how to develop resistances to these systems.
So this question was typed twice, so I'm going to read it as urgency. And it is a politics of consent and consensus a means or an end? Consensus can be very, very wrong, after all.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'd like to hear you talk about that in your work.
Consent, for me, when we think about consent and maybe with imaging and that kind of thing, we think of consent forms and these ways of saying yes. But I think, when you come out of other kinds of struggles, consent is about also the right to refusal and the power of saying no or not giving or holding in abeyance or holding back. So that kind of complicates what we mean when we're coming together around questions of a politics of consent. In terms of consensus, I don't think consent, I've been in a women and gender studies department for a long time. We operate by consensus. I'm very aware of its many dysfunctions. At the same time, part of what I think the interesting thing about having modes of consensus, and we have many different ways, like just how do you operate your GitHub can be thinking about modes of consensus. How do we make protocols that are making explicit relations of decision making in community? And we've talked a lot about, democratizing technology. And I think, consensus, democracy can sometimes hide these kind of hard questions about how do we actually make kind of protocols that recognize power and struggle always inadequately to do things together in community. So I would think that's what consensus puts on the table, is that kind of necessity of having those hard decisions about what is your protocol for your GitHub, or what is your protocol for deciding how you're going to collectively edit a document, or whatever it is.
Well, that's our time.
Can I
Unless
chime
George
one
wanted to
last
say
thing?
something.
And I would also add that the quality of consensus you reach also depends on the infrastructure or the culture that you have in place among the group of people, right? Mm-hmm. And maybe it works better in your department than my department, I don't know. But democratizing technology means you can catch the cops when they do bad things. It also means you can broadcast a killing on Facebook, right? So, it really depends on how society is set up and operates.
Well, if you have a process of consensus, you have a responsibility to actually if you have a process of consensus, you're not going to reach consensus all the time, but you have a responsibility as participants to say to each other, what you're doing is not right, or what you're doing has this implication. You have a responsibility to kind of call each other out and in to the responsibilities in your actions. And that is messy, it's uneasy, it's discomforting. It's easier to be in spaces where we're all being like polite and collegial, not talking about like the power in the room, and it's much harder to be in spaces where we're responsibilized to doing that in our activities of knowledge making. So we don't have to get along to have a process of consensus making. Even if we don't reach consensus, it's better to have the process anyways.
I agree.
Since we're being naughty and going over time anyway, I just wanted to put this question in the air because I think it's a good question. It doesn't have to be answered now unless somebody wants to answer it. But the question is this. You didn't say if the, whoa, where'd it go? You didn't say if the list of chemicals in the water were at anything like unsafe levels. Isn't chemophobia part of the problem in public knowledge? That's a good question.
Okay. So I didn't say if the list of chemicals were, can you say that again?
Were at anything like unsafe levels. Isn't chemophobia part of the problem in public knowledge? And I'm guessing chemophobia is people being afraid of chemicals.
People being afraid of chemicals. I worry about chemophobia as being another kind of gaslighting thing. So there's a long history of calling people who are worried about like the violence in their world hysterical, oversensitive, angry. And we have a problem that I know very well from my own work and the work of many colleagues, that our threshold levels for deciding safety, the whole history behind how we decide those, are so filled with politics. They're so filled with an effort to not regulate chemicals. So for example, in the United States, the EPA has not successfully had a kind of prohibition on a chemical since 1989. At the same time, 15,000 new patentable substances are introduced into the American Chemical Registry every day. So the scope of our not understanding about what is safe, or put a different way, what does it mean to be homotoxicus, is so profound that showing those numbers is just a heuristic. Showing those two different lists is just a heuristic to get you thinking that don't take those lists as truth-telling. Ask questions.
Thank you. That was a great answer. And thank you, everyone. Thank you all.